Our gospel text is another one of those familiar stories. You know, really most of the gospel texts are, if you've been at this for a while. It's the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, the first 11 verses, and that's the temptation story in Matthew. Now, it makes a difference whether or not it's in Matthew or in Mark or in Luke. It makes a difference because they each write their Gospels for a different reason. Now, when Matthew writes his Gospel, his interest in telling us this story is to try and find a way to set a standard that disciples will be able to live up to. So you see, this isn't a story about Jesus, the Superman, the super great. Right? This is intended to be the life of a teacher who people can be discipled after, who can follow, who can become like. With that in mind, would you listen for a creative word as Spirit brings it to you? So after Jesus was baptized and a voice came from heaven and said, "This is my Son, my beloved, in whom I am well pleased." After that, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." And by now that word ought to stand for a lot. So then the devil took him up to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, then throw yourself down, for it is written, God will command the angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." And Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put Adonai your God to the test." Again, the devil took him up to a very high mountain and showed him all of the rules, all of the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And the devil said to Jesus, "I will give you all of these if you will fall down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship Adonai your God, and serve only Adonai." Then the devil leapt him, and suddenly angels came and waited upon him. Delightful fable. Jesus goes off for 40 days and 40 nights, not an accident that it's 40 days and 40 nights, like the 40 years in the wilderness for the people of Israel. Because it's amazing what happens in the wilderness. You know, the wilderness is sometimes thought of as that dusty, hard, dry place. I guess when I think of the Middle East and the wilderness, that's what I think of. But I've been in other kinds of wildernesses. The week between final exams and graduation from high school, my friends Tom and Ted and I, we took off for Nova Scotia, drive all night long up Route 1. It was great deal of fun, and then we parked and off we went into the wilderness. We were initially using paths, but then we realized several days later that we were late and we needed to get back to the car soon. And so we decided to leave the paths and instead use our compass. All right? Believe it or not, we did not get lost. All right? Lost was not the problem. The hemlock forest was the problem. We came out of it exhausted, tense, dirty, sweaty, scratched up, scraped up. We'd gotten through the wilderness, but it was kind of a formative experience for us. You know, when you're pushed out to your limits a little bit, you have to let go of everything that's not important. That's the wilderness, that place of formation. And even if it's not a literal wilderness, perhaps it's a metaphor, it's still, you know, that place where the spiritual quest happens, a place of challenge. That's why the story of the people of Israel is they move into the wilderness to become formed as the people of God is placed in that location. And it is why Jesus moves into the wilderness following being called the Son of God. Now, in each case, these formative moments, these wilderness moments, they come after something has happened to change the way people see the world. So for the people of Israel, God had saved them, had brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And it's the wilderness where these things are worked out, where you then figure out what to do with the changes that have been made. Jesus was driven into the wilderness by the Spirit because he was responding to this clarion call that he was the Son of God. That is to say, the one who's responsible for the rule and the responsibility and the character and texture of the rule of God among all people. How is that going to fill out in his life? What did that mean for his life? You know, some people think about these temptations as Jesus was being tested, you know, and then you get all worried. Well, he was the Son of God. Could he fail the test? Couldn't he fail the test? Was it just a fake test? So on and so forth. It's not that kind of test. You know, it's the kind of test that forms somebody. There's no worry about whether or not you're going to fail it or succeed at it, but rather you go through the experience and you come out the other side a different kind of person. That's the kind of test this was. Jesus' character needed to be set in place in order to do the work of the Son of God. Disruption and then growth. That's the way it takes place. These fundamental stories in the scriptures, the Exodus in particular, but Jesus' story of moving into this new kind of life, I mean, that's how evolution works, you know. There's some trip, something that happens that shifts the balance of things in the created order. And then things have to adjust and move. I mean, biologists talk about punctuated equilibrium. That some startling change takes place in the created order, and then we go through an entire wilderness of time where we figure out what that exactly means and how the species need to adapt, move, and adjust. It takes place in the biological realm, and it takes place internally in each one of our lives. And it takes place within us as a group of people as well, this dynamic evolution. It's not like things just stay still. So you move from Exodus to Jesus. And people think that, you know, scholars compare these two stories. They recognize that there are reflections of the Exodus in this story about Jesus. That's why there are all these quotes in Scripture. There are quotes from Deuteronomy where the people of Israel have failed one test or another. Right? So folks think that, well, okay, Jesus just got it right. Let's compare them to the people of Israel long ago, and Jesus got it right this time, but it's not that simple. Because that would be assuming that the people of Israel, those thousands of years ago, were in about the same place consciously, in conscious evolution, as Jesus was. It's what some people come to be called the Flintstone fallacy. You know, it's like the cavemen. They were just like us. They just were cavemen. They didn't have, you know, the same kind of technological advantage. You know, you got the Flintstones and the Jetsons. Okay, and they're identically charactered to us, you know, the same conscious development. I mean, it's a fallacy. It's not how it operated. No, they were asking about different things. Meaning had become different between the telling of these two stories. Oh, there were some elements that were the same. But there are different things going on as meaning develops. So let's take the stones turning to bread. Right? This comes from a time in the Exodus when people were complaining. God had saved them, brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, and they were moving into the wilderness, and there didn't seem enough food to eat, and so they started complaining to Moses. Oh, you just brought us out here to die. You know, absolutely no trust in the movement and power of God. After all God's done? You think God's going to say, what? But they didn't trust. They had to learn in the wilderness how to trust God for their perceived needs. That's what they were after in this temptation story that they had. They needed to learn in that wilderness how to trust God for those perceived needs. But that's not exactly what Jesus was learning. Now, Jesus was tempted to use power differently. It wasn't about trusting God to fill his perceived needs. In this story, Jesus had the power to turn stones into bread. He could use his own power to fill his own needs. The question is, what kind of an impact would that have on the world around him? Is he going to rely on this spiritual power to make him comfortable? Is he going to focus on his needs? Or is he going to focus each step of the way on the word, that creative word and direction and unfolding of God? Jesus chose that higher consciousness, that place or a view where you could see what God was about in the created order. And so he said, no. Human beings don't live by bread alone. They live on the word of God, on that word that goes forth and makes beauty out of chaos. Second temptation brings him up to the pinnacle of the temple and says, well, jump off. It says that you're going to be saved. Right? The angels will come and take care of you. And this apparently, given the quote that Jesus uses, it balances against this second incident with the people of Israel at Meribah. And in that situation, the Israelites didn't have water. And it's God's given them food. God's gotten them out of Egypt. God's done a great deal for them, but they're scared. There's not enough water around, and they're complaining to Moses, take us back to Egypt. We want to go back into slavery rather than to die out here of thirst. Again, they're learning how to trust whether God is going to give what's needed, what they perceive is needed. So it raises this one question to me, though. What would it take for them to trust God? What would it take for them to trust that God was going to take care of the next thing? And rather than worry about them, ask yourself. If God was a wish-making machine and could fill your wishes, okay, what would God have to do to get you to the point that you trusted that God would move things forward in God's loving and appropriate way? I know what it is for me. It's pretty sick. The way I was brought up, this is just sort of a psychological dilemma that preachers' kids have sometime. I was in competition with Jesus, bottom line, for my parents' time, okay? I'd literally have to start a new religion, okay? And it would have to be, pretty darn successful. Otherwise, I maybe can't trust that God's power is unfolding within me and that I've been loved the way that Jesus' character was loved. Now, I hope I've actually grown beyond that a lot, but if you get down to that fear place, and you're afraid of whether or not God is going to take care of you, whether or not the universe can be trusted to fill your perceived needs, well, what would it take? Same question really comes to Jesus. Devil's challenging him. Find out. Find out whether or not you can trust. But Jesus wasn't going there. Jesus knew that he was going to be jumping into the abyss, most certainly. But he wasn't even looking for God to save his life at that moment. Now, his consciousness was bigger, took a step back, wanted to see the entire movement of God's creative project and find his own place within it. wasn't going to jump off because he was prepared to jump so that his life had meaning in the context of God's creative project. The third one is really about idolatry. You know, will you bow down to me? I'll give you all the political power you could possibly need in order to get the things done that you want to get done, Jesus. Give you everything you need to be able to pull it off. All right? Because Jesus had an agenda. And he actually thought that there should be a just society. He thought that poor people should have what they needed in order to survive and even thrive. You know, he thought that there needed to be kindness and compassion operating in the world, and not war and death and the effort to make people, coerce people into doing what you wanted them to do. He was offered the power to do that, and yet this is a question about whether you're going to jump hold and try and grab onto that way of looking at power, or whether you're going to stick with the power that you want to put in place in that new reign. You know, idolatry was always the thing that people Israel did. They were practical, you know. You had to be practical in that area. If your crops weren't doing well and your neighbor 2 tribes over said, well, we worship this particular God and our crops are doing fine, well, then it's really tempting just to be a little practical and, you know, pray to this new God. I mean, especially since you don't understand weather patterns at that point, or different kinds of soil, or whatever else might go into this. So there was a temptation just to kind of go with the idols, or for Christians, for Matthew's people. There's a question of whether or not you bowed down to Caesar. Because in the Roman Empire, you were pretty much allowed to worship whatever god you wanted, just so long as you also worshiped Caesar. You know, and in fact, Caesar's cult, the religion that was wrapped around all that, it was also the banking system. So we're talking about Christians who were kind of on the outs. You know, they couldn't participate in the economic structures of the time in order to get ahead. And so there was a real temptation to go ahead and use those structures which were unjust, just to sort of get by and make things happen, to make the world fit into a just and compassionate society. That's the temptation there. But instead, Jesus said, no. I'm not going to take the power and make it happen that way. I'm going to trust in the nature of God's creative power. Trust in the unfolding of Spirit. I'm going to say that everything that's happening now is as it should be in God's created order. Now, we've talked about that before. Appropriate resistance because things aren't all right, right? There's not justice in the world. There's not compassion in the world. There's too much violence in the world. But there is a difference between approaching life as saying there is something wrong and I must fix it, and approaching life that I must trust God, that things are the way they need to be. Everything's all right. There's a spiritual teacher whose name I have sadly forgotten, who says that problems did not come about in the world because people sat down to have a meeting to make some problems. Problems come up because people sit down to have a meeting to discuss solutions when they have not dealt with their own internal suffering. Everything is all right is a question of letting go and resting on the power of God and not perceiving whatever thing has been happening in your life as being the horror and suffering that you must control and get rid of. It's when we try and move life and shape life differently that we move into a world of injustice. We seek security, and so we play on an economic system that does not allow for justice. We're tempted always in a church to use secular means to make things happen, and yet to use secular means that we're wrapped up in the same thing that the world around us is wrapped up in. No. Jesus calls us to this different kind of trust. Because we're asked to be disciples here, to follow. And rather than take hold of this power that'll adjust the world the way we think it ought to be, we say things are all right as they are, and they are dynamic. They will change because the power of God is unfolding and making all things new. So you move from this seeking to trust God to fill my individual needs. That's what was going on in the story of the Exodus. And you move it to a place of greater developed consciousness that it's not about me. It's about the power of all creation. It's about the unity that each one of us is part of. It's that unity that we can't achieve unless you show up. I love that. God can't get it done without you. You have a unique role to play in trusting the powerful creative spirit to unfold within you. And the thing is that it brings joy and freedom to have that sense of living in the creative arms of God. So in the quiet, why don't you think about those questions, those temptations? How much would it take? What would God need to do for you to make you trust the universe as it unfolds? What's important to you? What gives your life meaning? Is the living out of a secure individual life or being part of that larger, gorgeous project of God's?